But in the meantime, we are going to talk about one thing that is topical in the rugby world at the moment, which is the elections for the World Rugby, the head honcho, I guess, in terms of the next 4 years. Yeah. We have incumbent Bill Beaumont and up-and-coming star / former
current vice president.
He did step down, I believe, a few months ago just to run Augustín Pichot. Obviously, the vote, I think, has happened or is happening over the few days. As we shoot this, it's Monday, so this will probably be up by Tuesday. But we won't know until mid-May the results of that election. But it is an interesting one. It's very rare that these elections are carried out in the public domain. But obviously, as we've alluded to, there's nothing else to talk about in rugby, so it has been kind of pushed to the forefront of the rugby media world, and it is definitely consequential. They're very interesting kind of yin and yang thing here. There's definitely a narrative of kind of old school kind of establishment politics in Bill Beaumont and who is the incumbent versus kind of the maverick of Gus Pichot, which is a nice narrative. There's also the northern hemisphere, southern hemisphere divide that is possibly more pertinent. It's
definitely more pertinent. Yeah. Well, no, I wouldn't say definitely. Both of those dynamics exist.
Yeah.
In part because Pichot has played it up. I mean, Pichot he is a politician.
He is.
He's he's this.
He's got charisma.
Yeah,
he speaks very well
and charismatic, and he's ran a good media campaign. Obviously, in this sports media desert.
Yeah.
He has just stolen the headlines with and he's positioned himself very, very brilliantly and given himself as good a chance as he can against the wise old dogs in Beaumont and our French friend Bernard Laporte.
Yes, it's definitely interesting that it's tough to there's pros and cons to both. We've read both manifestos. All parties involved have interesting ideas for where they kind of see the game going. It's just hard to we have evidence based on Bill Beaumont's tenure there. We don't really with Pichot. We don't know
some with
Pichot. There's also limits to just the sway that World Rugby has. Even the head of World Rugby, when there are vice-like grips, things like the French domestic leagues and things like the English Union, the All Blacks as well. There are a few more powers at play than just World Rugby. Yeah. It sounds all encompassing when you say World Rugby, but it's not actually. But it is interesting in terms of some of their mantras are very different, and some of their ideals are very different. In terms of just where they want to bring the game and where they see the game as being all right at the moment. I suppose we can lay out the benefits or drawbacks of either. I don't know, which would you like to start with? Will we start with the challenger or the incumbent?
I think the incumbent is probably a decent place to start in terms of where we're at with Bill Beaumont. There are successes he can point to. One of the things that World Rugby has been emphasising that they do have a lot of control over, a lot of the emphasis of this campaign has been, structured tournaments, which can be a bit of a red herring in terms of, actually generating income for World Rugby, in terms of actually, no matter how many times you restructure a tournament and do this and that and this and that with it, it's not actually a decent substitute for just the fundamentals of growing the game in different countries and investing at a grassroots level and instilling a love in the game and in a more broad base of countries than we currently have. That's usually the solution to make more money, whereas really there's an element of just trying of with the tournament restructures that are being suggested by everybody of just tossing the deck aside and trying to stack it in a different way so that it creates more money with the same materials and
that's definitely folly.
It doesn't seem like that's the wisest idea. But what Bill Beaumont has emphasised in his tenure in World Rugby is law changes, and he can point to some successes in terms of the tackle area. He's brought clarity to that area where there hasn't been clarity, and he's brought a bit more safety, I think.
Probably true. Definitely true, in fact,
and maintained it's maintained its entertainment faction. You can still defend, you can still attack, but the laws around the tackle law have been gotten under control, and likewise the scrum. There's more sense and reason to the scrum than there would have been 10 years ago.
Well, certainly in the crouch, touch, pause, engage year, where that was where it reached its height of just maddening. You couldn't get through a scrum. You had scrums that lasted 10 minutes. That was the Wayne Barnes kind of 100-minute game of scrum resets was around then as well. It's much clearer now. There's more of a rhythm, and you can technical scrummaging is getting rewarded as well. There are really great technical scrummagers out there getting the benefits from it.
It's a great great era for the scrum. Their innovative ideas are still coming through, like the 50-22 kicking rule. They're only being introduced at the moment. Obviously, whenever we get out of this, we're going to see that being introduced more than likely. There are good ideas that are being approached reasonably coming from World Rugby at the moment, and Bill Beaumont can point to that as a massive success, and that's an area of great emphasis for him. The big issue, I think, the big sort of elephant in the room and the frustration that a lot of people have is just the current system of, they pay lip service to it being a global game, but the Six Nations has just a colossal sway.
It's holding all the cards.
They hold all the cards, and they have, they don't have an interest, let's be real, they don't have a massive interest in making the game go global.
No.
The likes of Scotland, Ireland, Wales, Italy, like none of them would trade, 3 more competitive European nations for a threat to their current position.
Yeah.
And
which is unfortunate, because that's small-minded thinking on in terms of
absolutely.
the game. But there is value to the tradition of the Six Nations. There's certainly value in terms of the revenue of the Six Nations, and the Sanzar nations would complain of it being unfair. But things like Super Rugby and Rugby Championship just doesn't bring the same profit, and it's a small game, and you do need some flagship marquee tournaments as well. So I understand protecting the Six Nations tournament, but what I can't really abide in is there's some kind of cynical aspects to Beaumont's campaign as well, where he'll pat himself on the back because now Fiji has a vote at the table, but it's like they have one vote at the table. Like that's nothing. It's not a sway. Whereas like the deck is still heavily stacked in Europe's favour, and it means that like going into this thing,
basic things like where money is divided, but where money is invested, and. Obviously it's easy to sell a team like Japan because Japan is a big country with a lot of money, but the basic things like a promotion and relegation, or a pathway to promotion and relegation in the Six Nations, are just off the table because of the opposition of those unions. And there's no indication from the Beaumont establishment that there's no urgency in changing that, and so
which seems to be the frustration in Pichot that's led to him running part of, at least.
Totally, and just a frustration in general with the fact that they, like, tier 2 sides are getting a rough deal, and like you get occasional little windfalls. Like Georgia can join the PNC. The PNC is decent when it does happen, but they're all very peripheral, and there isn't a pathway to more competitive games at the top level, and like that's a source of frustration, and something that Pichot, I think the biggest differential perhaps between them is that Pichot is advocating a more equitable vote share among nations.
Yes.
So you're talking about Ireland gets 1 vote, Fiji gets 1 vote, Samoa gets 1 vote, Tonga gets 1 vote. That's perhaps the most progressive place that we could go, and that's a lot of these unions are going to know what's best for themselves.
Yes.
So giving them a more equitable say within the organisation is perhaps the best way forward, and that's really where the challenge, I think, comes from.
It's also where the kind of the difference in mantra comes from, because Bill Beaumont is a huge rugby fan and an absolute like a legend of the game in many ways, but he is not interested in changing that or shaking that up. Like there's definitely people at the big table and there's people at the small table, and that doesn't see, there's kind of ring fencing going on with that at the moment in the current setup, and he is the status quo. Well, that's what he represents.
There is ring fencing, and there are little movements here and there to try and change that, but anything. And it's hard to envisage World Rugby by themselves being able to change this, but changing of the vote shares will be a way to do it. But at the moment, there is little can be done, because the second anyone tries to shake up any minor threat might appear to the presence of an Italy or a Scotland or a France, etc., it'll just get quashed down. And it would behoove us, before we just move on and take a broad look at Pichot, it would be remiss not to mention the other sort of cloud over Beaumont's candidacy, which is sort of the presence of Bernard Laporte, the Francis Keane situation, which is not like massive in and of itself. It's just an indication of how business is done, in the sense that it's like there's quid pro quo going on, where it's like, you second my nomination, I'll get you into the executive committee.
Hints of cronyism.
I couldn't
everywhere.
give a shite if you're what you've done in your past, as long as you're on team me, and we're going to just hush and let's do this thing.
And that's definitely the cloud over.
That's how Bernard Laporte does business. I mean, you're talking about a guy who worked in the Sarkozy government, and that's how potentially World Rugby would operate. I mean, the most dangerous thing from this election is the prospect of 4 years' time Bernard Laporte being head of World Rugby.
That's true.
Which is just a bad look for the game. It's like Sepp Blatter in FIFA. Like it's just a dreadful look for the game, and these guys tend to look out for numero uno before they look out for anyone else.
For
as well.
sure,
It's not a good prospect for tier 2 sides, and you saw examples of that in the in the 2023 World Cup bid as well, where it was like very savvily, launching this media campaign. Like I frankly, I thought the whole thing was shady. Like Bernard Laporte gets a lot of criticism for the media campaign ripping the recommendation which gave it to South Africa, and then France took enough of the votes away. I thought the recommendation was trash. The recommendation trashed Ireland's bid, which obviously we're self-interested, but reading through it was so, some of those critiques were sparing in detail and unbelievably harsh when it came to Ireland, and then charitable when it came to South Africa.
Yeah.
And so that knocked us out, and then he led a campaign against South Africa and a campaign against the reporting this way and that way, the other way, and what ended up happening is France got the nomination, but it was dirty tricks, and there was sort of a cloud over it, and that was the nature of Bernard Laporte, and just that whole thing does leave an out, like where I think Pichot, he's charismatic young politician, he's not got the cleanest hands either, but he's probably a step up.
Yeah, for sure. And
just in terms of the aesthetic of the game.
Yeah, for sure. And it's also like, even though he has been involved with it, like he's a part of Laporte's, or not Laporte, of Beaumont's team all through this last 4 years, and he is quite a good outspoken part. He seems generally frustrated with the slow pace of change, or just seemingly fundamentally opposed on certain things. He's a Southern Hemisphere guy. He's an Argentinian guy. It's a new look for the game. The traditional powers in rugby come from the Northern Hemisphere, and more often than not England and France, and it's Six Nations, and that goes way back, even when you're thinking of this kind of Sanzar nation splitting to try and start the World Cup, which only happened in the 80s, and it was coming for a long time, but again it was Six Nations pushback that prevented it. And eventually
the Six Nations have a history throughout the tenure of rugby. The sort of old boys club, they're extremely protectionist.
Yes. Yeah, and like you'd like to think that that's changed, but then even little things like the Saris thing from last year showed just how much it still is permeated in parts of the game. There's kind of a tradition of ducking the authorities or trying to do things underhandedly, and as well as just a protectionist streak of trying to mind the status quo. Whereas Pichot does represent kind of new blood in that regard. He doesn't come from that tradition at all. He's more of he feels like more of an earnest, kind of just an optimist about the game, and a bit of a dreamer sometimes. Some of the notions he's put forward in his manifesto do feel fanciful for the role that he's going for, and for the tenure that he's going to have to do it. Like in 4 years, I don't know if he can implement a kind of global calendar year for it. I don't know if that's even feasible.
Well, that's on everybody. That's on everybody's. Everybody seems to be calling for that, but I'm yet to hear a proposal that makes sense. He has two tangible things that he can point to. He's responsible primarily for Argentina being in the Rugby Championship.
Yes,
he championed that. He campaigned for it. He got it.
Yeah,
and that is just an unmitigated success story.
It is.
And it's one of those things where unless you have a young ambitious guy driving it just doesn't get done. And this is the exasperation. Like, how long have we been saying, and everybody been saying, Georgia deserve a pathway to the Six Nations. Yeah. And it's just
they don't have a Pichot driving.
It's not going to happen. Yeah. Because they just won't make it happen.
Yeah.
And they'll give you crumbs here and crumbs there, but ultimately the level playing field needed to compete is just not going to be given, short of them doing something like what Japan have done.
Yes, which is like Japan is a separate entity because it's a massive country, and it's also unique in that we're talking. Actually, another thing in Pichot's thing is his private investment thing. He's a bit more open to it. He does. It's part of his manifesto. He wants the likes of CVC involved, which could be potentially dangerous. But he's definitely right in saying we need outside investment, and it needs to be dealt with. Like, he feels that in his tenure with Beaumont, they have been again just kind of protectionist and standoffish in terms of those negotiations that do have to happen. And if you want the outside money, there needs to be a clear purpose for it, and there definitely needs to be profit for this. It's more complicated than
the only thing is
white.
The only thing is, like, some of the rhetoric on that regard, like the CVC thing is, it's reported as a universal positive. It might be. It's money. It's money into the game. Yeah. It might be. But giving them a seat at the decision-making table, the sort of venture capitalists that run these things tend to be interested in one thing and one thing only, which is, you know, profit, and very often quick profit.
Yeah.
It's get in, invest, make a profit, get out.
Yeah.
And very often, you know,
that can be at the expense of something that's been built.
Any long-term thinking.
Well, the thing about it is, like, it's not football. Football is a global economy all of its own, and like it can subsist and survive even with the likes of Sepp Blatter being corrupt as hell at the top of it. There's just so much money in that game that it's self-sustaining, and there's so much interest too. Like, rugby has to fight a bit more for that. So the notion, and you do see some notions from, like, invest in the Premiership. We want to try and get rid of the Champions Cup because we want the Premiership to be this flagship thing, and we should ring fence the Premiership, and then hopefully people in America will tune in on a Saturday to watch Gloucester face Bath. And it's like, that's never going to happen, like, ever, and no matter how much you want it to
be in the Premier League. No, and it's tough, and the sort of magic solutions that these guys are going to come up could be, you know, bright and shiny enough to attract some sponsorship, and then all of a sudden CVC have made their profit and they're out, and then long term there isn't anything sustainable there, and it doesn't end up working. And that would be one of the sort of one of the risks that I would associate with a Pichot presidency, is just falling for a sort of a quick, attractive solution to a complicated problem.
He's also
I know it was Bernard Laporte's idea. So, you know, it's as much a critique of everyone as it is of Pichot, but like this Club World Cup idea that pops up, which, you know, on paper kind of sexy, who doesn't want to see, you know, Leinster play the Crusaders or Saracens play, you know, the Sharks, or, you know, etc. It's a fun idea, but first of all, in practice, it's going to be very difficult to work for player welfare, etc. And second of all, there's just no guarantee
that's going to be a better product than what the Champions Cup is currently.
Exactly. There's no guarantee at all, and the more you tinker, the less people get invested.
Yes, as you can see with Super Rugby, that's been constantly in flux for the last 10 years, and what we've seen is dwindling interest, and to the point where the Australian Union's now in crisis because they can't compete for eyeballs with all the other sport. Like, Australia is a sports mad country, and there's a lot of sport happening in it, and rugby's getting kind of consumed by all that because there's no, like, the Super Rugby. A few years ago, the Lions got to the final of it without ever playing in New Zealand because the format was so nuts. So you don't want to be chopping up what's already good just for the sake of what might make a quick buck or what looks potentially interesting on paper.
Exactly. And there's definitely a concern with that, and that's a concern on both fronts. But it does seem as though Pichot, even though this particular example is Laporte's idea, it seems as though Pichot is more likely to be sort of aggressive and knee-jerky with massive changes to format than, you know, your more old school protectionist Bill Beaumont. Although, you know, until a more equitable voting system within the organisation works, nothing is going to happen shy of the approval of you know, the Six Nations unions.
That's true.
Although, you know, it's important to note, in the context of this election, the Six Nations unions are behind Beaumont, but in general they aren't a monolith, and very often England and France can be swayed.
They can be swayed by money more
exactly.
often than not.
And neither union has a particular love for the Champions Cup, as we know.
Which is unfortunate, really, because it's the best club competition in the game.
No question. and certainly it would be a shame, especially for us Irish fans, if that was to go away. Listen, before we move on, obviously, from Pichot, it's just as it would be remiss of us not to mention the Laporte issues and the Francis Keane issues hanging over Bill Beaumont. There are a couple of potential conflicts of interest with Pichot that just haven't been reported. So he has a job with the Australian billionaire who set up the breakaway competition, you know, the one with the Western Force, etc. Pichot works for him in South America in some capacity. He's on the board of USA Rugby at the moment. So, like, there's just a couple. He also has his own media company, which has ties to ESPN, etc. And
could be a positive, but it's also
there's just conflicts of interest, and apparently World Rugby have rules that say that if you do have such conflicts of interest, you're not going to be able to attend some meetings, etc., which can't really work if you're the head of World Rugby, and just none of this has been discussed in the context of his nomination, which is weird. But you know, he's run a very savvy media campaign, and it hasn't come up. So.
No, one thing that was brought up by was it Leo, just from a Pacific Islander point of view, Pichot is very, very rigid on the eligibility rules, right. Which is a problem if you're a Tongan pro and want to be repatriated, or if you're the likes of a Malachi Fekitoa or Charles Piutau, who have a few caps for the All Blacks but can't now contribute to either Fiji.
It's a very popular idea in the islands for obvious reasons. You know, first of all, the idea of nationality as a rigid singular thing is perhaps flawed in a lot of contexts. You know, there's a lot of people who in the world who have dual nationhood just in their own personage. Yes. In terms of, I feel I'm a Kiwi and I'm a Fijian. Yeah.
Like, it's not that uncommon a thing. Whereas Pichot does seem, he's very prideful and he's very nationalistic, and he was one of the big outspoken opponents of Jean Klein's inclusion in the Ireland squad. That got reported over here. He appeared on Off the Ball talking about exactly that. I think.
Yeah, exactly.
So that would be a factor in terms of just the likes of Fiji.
What's worth noting is that other tier 2 nations don't support it. Yeah. For example, Georgia would be very much opposed to it, and in fact most tier 2 nations don't support it. They would be fearful of it being exploited the other way. Yeah. You know, where you have Mamuka Gorgodze, for example, could be capped for France now because he qualified on eligibility. Sure. And ripped away from Georgia. Yeah. No, it's true. That's a massive concern of tier 2 sides as well. So there's two sides to that coin. For sure. But there's no question that with Pichot in charge of World Rugby, it's one of the things that he's passionate about. So
and it's one of the things he would have sway over. He could definitely could impact.
He already has
things.
He's apparently responsible, at least in part, for moving from 3 to 5 years.
There you go. Yeah, and that could go out further again if he gets the head like that.
Forever.
Yeah, indeed.
Where were you born? Be doing blood tests.
Yeah, birth certs at the ready.
Yeah.
A kit bag and a birth cert to come to the World Cup.
Yeah,
so those are the two candidates, I suppose, and. It's tough to see. Like the optimist in me does kind of hope that Pichot gets in there just for the fresh blood of it all, and just to kind of to mix up the game, because I don't see it moving very quickly with Bill Beaumont. Other than obviously things like rule changes, it's hard to see Bill Beaumont losing it. And even in watching him in interviews, he's very quietly confident, because he should be. Like 20 of the votes are sewn up prior. Then you need 26.
He's going to get the Canadian vote obviously as well, because their union has a lot of ties to the sort of old school Six Nations heads. He's going to get. It was already announced today. He's got the Rugby Europe vote as well. So,
which is a bit of a blow to Pichot's campaign. Yes, he's trying to champion the tier 2 sides, and if Rugby Europe.
For me, it's completely short sighted if you're a tier 2 side. Like, I think, you know, in the context of this election, a lot is being promised that can't be delivered. Yeah. But one of the really the biggest material difference is Pichot's championing of, we're going to fundamentally restructure the voting system within the organisation to make it more equitable. That's the biggest single change that could be done by either of them, and that's what Pichot advocates. And I think in the context of wanting the game to be global, ultimately,
that's where it has to go.
That's what we want. And you know, a combination of that and not wanting to see Bernard Laporte near the authority of the game would have me favour Pichot's candidacy.
However, I just don't. My prediction hat is saying that it's going to be 4 more years of Beaumont and then possibly Laporte thereafter, which is and unfortunately,
in case you haven't noticed, I'm not a biggest fan.
But what it is interesting, and it's definitely the rugby news that's happening at the moment. Shy of a few transfer things here and there and some injury updates. That's about the extent of it. Thank you very much for watching that video. If you're new here, please like and subscribe down below, and leave a comment as well, because we enjoy the chat and conversation. Thank you.